Hello and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co-host, Elwyn Robinson, the creator and founder of Advanced Health Genetics, the Hormetics Weight Optimization System, and the author of the Rejuvenate Blueprint. And today, my lovely listeners, we are carrying on a conversation on an episode we did probably about over a year ago, Ray Peat's most controversial theories. So there were a few questions and things that have come up from you guys in your wonderful interest there. So we thought, let's dive a little deeper into some of the theories that we discussed before, just have more of a conversation and maybe discuss some that we haven't discussed before. So Elwyn, prior to us hitting record, we were discussing some of these controversial opinions. And I wanted to ask you, so we could share with our listeners, why did you feel it was important to do this episode today?
Well, a combination of things. First of all, those review of Dr. Ray Peat's theories that we did, I think it was a year and a half ago now, were very popular. But I didn't want to do a follow-up for no reason. It's not as if he's come up with new theories since or anything, because unfortunately he passed. But I keep hearing about him and I keep thinking about him. And just the other day I was doing an interview with Morley Robbins of the Root Cause Protocol, and in my research for that, I was, saw a lot of overlap with Pete's work. So one of the first questions I asked him, I'm not sure if this episode will come out before or after that one, but one of the first questions I asked him is if he was familiar with Dr. Pete's work, and he said, "Oh yeah, of course." And he actually acknowledged that kind of the centerpiece of his whole theory on the root cause of all disease kind of came from like a question asked in one of Dr. Pete's articles. It's like, that's interesting. And I just saw this infographic on Twitter being shared by someone. It didn't seem to be a Ray Peat account specifically, so I didn't make a note of who it was. Just of Dr. Peat's theories, and it made me think that when I go through the replying to the comments, which I try and do often, a lot of the time people are asking me, okay, but what do you think, Owen? And people are confused because I have someone on and then I have someone else on who has completely opposite point of view, and it's a fair question, right? I didn't want this channel to be one of those like interview channels where just every week there's a different expert and every week that different expert is saying something completely different, because while that's like interesting and like stimulates the intellectual curiosity and stuff like that, it gets the dopamine flowing, to be honest, if it's something that you're interested in. It can leave people feeling very overwhelmed and confused, and I especially saw that with those health summits, right, where people would sign up and over the course of 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, something like that, there'd be like 30 experts, 50 experts on a particular topic, hormones or fatigue or heart health or whatever, and they'd all be sharing their perspective and they'd all be giving different opinions. And I think one of my strengths is being able to hear a lot of different perspectives and being able to synthesize the information and pass out what is and isn't true, what is hyperbole, and looking for the context dependent truth, right? So rather than just working out who is right and who is wrong, or if two people are saying opposite things, assuming that one must be lying or both, I'm like trying to work out, okay, well, in what particular context is this person right? And then in what other context is this other person who's saying the exact opposite right? And this is one of the things that led me to genetics, because it is one of the big things that people, well, it's something that people to some degree, well, there's something you can't do anything about. You can't do anything about the genetics you're born with. Of course, you can do something about what you do with those. That's the epigenetic factor. But still, there's a reason why some people struggle a lot more with some things than others. There's a reason why some people respond much better to some advice than others, right? And so, in fact, there's various reasons, but genetics is one of them. So anyway, I don't want this to be a, thing where we give people endlessly overwhelming and confusing information. So when people ask, okay, but what do you believe, Elwyn? That's a fair question. And so when I saw this list of like controversial Ray Peat inspired takes, and I'm going to say it that way because when I really looked into them, I'd say over half of them are directly from Dr. Ray Peat, but some of them may be from his community. Some of them may be from some of the people who have kind of carried the torch from his work beyond his death, like Jay Feldman, who we had on here, Hans Amato, who we had on here, and some other people as well, like Danny Roddy, Georgie Dinkoff, and various others. So I'm not with that list, with that kind of infographic I shared, Chrissy. I mean, we'll discuss, do we think this is directly from Dr. Pete or maybe from his followers or his community? But the more interesting question to me is it correct? And, the example I gave earlier of Morley Robbins is just, one example, but there are a lot of ways that Dr. Pete has influenced conventional ideas of health. And probably the biggest one, I can't remember if it's on that list, is this idea of seed oils, right? This is something that when you were first talking about was regarded as the most bizarre pseudoscience, right? In the 80s, when everyone was pushing heart-healthy margarine and heart-healthy vegetable oils to, now we have, even politicians and, influencers and people with, real ability to make impact, pushing for removing seed oils from the food supply and, talking about heart-healthy tallow, heart-healthy coconut oil, heart-healthy butter even, which would have just seemed crazy, like when Dr. Pete was first starting his work. So he was a pioneer. However, do I belong in that category of other names of like followers of his work? I would say no. I mean, it depends. It's certainly not an insult to be in that list. I think I don't agree with enough of what he said to be classed as a Ray Peat follower, as a Ray Peat teacher or whatever. But I do agree with quite a bit, and I think that a lot of emphasis is put on his food recommendations. I'm saying it that way because some of his followers there's no such thing as a Ray Peat diet. All he talked about is, well, we'll get to that in a second. But it wasn't, fundamentally diet. And so, just doing what's right. But even the diet, although I don't eat sugar and I don't eat fruit, which are, often considered cornerstones, I found more and more I do base my diet around certain other foods, which would also be Ray Peat approved. And so, yeah, I thought, that I see enough questions in the comments that may be worth an episode. People may actually be interested in my take in it. And then, of course, Chrissy, you did it with me a year and a half ago. Anything that you want to share your opinion on with all these as well, because you may have tried some of this stuff, you may have done your own research, you may have done your own tests with some of his theories, and share your take as well. Like, does it work? Is it true? Is it helpful?
No, absolutely. I mean, looking at that list, there were definitely a couple that I'm like, oh, huh, and then there's one or two that I'm like, yeah, because I've been really looking at that, and that makes sense, So no, happy to get into it. Yeah,
and we'll try and do it quicker. And just to say, when we did it before, you read out excerpts from his work, so we were quoting him directly. We're not going to do that again. We're just going to give our opinions. If you would like to hear more, direct excerpts from his work, then check out our first episodes on Dr. Pete.
Beautiful. So let's, the first one that popped off right for me is caffeine is a vitamin.
Yeah. This is one I don't agree with at all. I think I've softened my stance on caffeine a little bit, and it makes sense that given my general view of how all of us are different and unique, and so different things are good for different people. And there is a genetic component to it. Some people are much more likely to get anxiety from caffeine, for instance, based on their genetics. I'm actually not one of those people, even though I get anxiety from it now. But that's probably because, for other reasons, I don't have any stimulants of any kind, first of all. So I'm not kind of used to the effect of the stimulant. But to be fair, I used to drink a vast amount of coffee and I don't know, survived. I was fine. So, but there are some people who've never drunk. I have a client who I don't think is ever had more than a sip of coffee in his whole life, because that doesn't suit him. That doesn't suit his genetics. That doesn't suit his particular metabolic profile. So is coffee like a vitamin? I think no, because that's absurd, because the idea of vitamin implies it is essential, right? That every person must have it. And if you don't have it, it's going to cause severe illness or death. I have not had caffeine I've barely had it for 18 years, and I've not had it at all for several. So if it were a vitamin, I would be feeling terrible. So that one to me is definitely, obviously, not true. I don't think he actually said it's a vitamin, but I think he said it's like vitamin-like, or so beneficial it's like a vitamin or something like that. Even that, I would say, I think it's spurious, to be honest. So you started with one that I completely disagree with.
And it was one that I think as well is very controversial in my opinion, because like you were just saying, not everybody has caffeine. And again, I used to ingest copious amounts. I think too, my tolerance, it was built up to it now, having abstained from it for so long. Yes, I can feel the heart rate racing. I can feel those things. Now, if I need to stay awake, of course, if you want to class that as a vitamin for anti-sleep, then maybe we can look at it like that, but no, not necessarily. But then,
that's a medicinal or a herbal, right? The whole point to me is vitamin is something you must have, or you become ill and you might die. And caffeine is just not in that category.
No, I agree with you. One other thing that popped into my mind, and I know that's not necessarily in the vitamin category, but people, and I don't want to detract too much, but maybe this will be a quick one, is that sometimes people say that caffeine is a delivery system. Can you explain that? And is that true?
That is true. Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely is helpful to deliver other nutrients more quickly to the blood, and even on a cellular level. And to be honest, other than just keeping you alive if you're driving late or whatever, kind of obvious angle, that's one of the most legitimate uses, I would say, for it probably. Alcohol, though, just to clarify, is also a very effective delivery system. So doesn't mean it's a vitamin, but it can be useful.
No, absolutely. Some of the tinctures and things, especially, if you want to abstain from alcohol, you have to look on the label, because alcohol, as you just said, yes, it is a good delivery system. Okay, so the next one that I've seen on the list is aspirin and B vitamins cure the C word.
Yeah. I don't know. So all these are written in a provocative way, obviously. Like
very provocative.
Yeah, a Ray Peat fan could easily go through these and tear them all apart. He didn't say exactly that, blah blah blah. So, but he definitely talked about those possibilities, and I know his student friends, etc. Georgi Dinkov is doing studies right now, I think, on rats, mice, using high doses of certain B vitamins and aspirin, and creating that effect. There's definitely some evidence, I've looked this up, even in the mainstream, that aspirin can prevent or even reduce the expression of some C words. So heart disease is considered like one big monolithic thing. See where there's like loads of different ones, and they're all treated as if they're completely different. Obviously, some alternative health practitioners dispute that. They say, it's the common cause of all of them. They may well be right, but anyway. So some types, definitely aspirin can be effective for. There is evidence for that. There is less evidence for the B vitamins, and that's, people like Georgia trying to create the evidence by doing studies, which is fantastic, awesome. But I wouldn't be hugely surprised, because, the basis of this theory is that ultimately the C word illness is created by the energy production process not working correctly. If you're eating clean, exercising, and your belly fat just won't shift, listen up. The number one cause for this happening is insulin resistance. It's the number one hormonal imbalance, which explains why people in their 30s, 40s, and beyond just can't lose weight. I'm Owen Robinson, and together with Dr. Miriam Mikitsky, we created the Hormetics Weight Optimization Formula. Insulin is a key part of that. More and more people every year are being diagnosed with insulin resistance. It is the number one reason why people struggle to lose weight so much. And that's why we created the Insulin Balance Formula. It's our most popular formula. It contains precisely chosen quantities of berberine, fenugreek, zinc, and folate, which are all clinically studied ingredients shown to lower insulin, kill cravings, and turn your body from a fat storer to a fat burner. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/insulin, order now, and you'll be invited to join our clinical study the moment you check out at no extra cost, so you can track exactly how well and how effectively it works for you. Use code REJUVENATE as well to get 20% off. End the blood sugar roller coaster. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/insulin and use code REJUVENATE for 20% off now. The Warburg effect. So that's the idea that, and I think it's not really disputed, that aerobic glycolysis, so how C word cells, they drastically increase their glucose uptake and convert it to lactic acid or lactate. Even when there is enough oxygen around, rather than using oxidative phosphorylation, which is a far more efficient and energy abundant method of energy generation. And so the theory around it is that the problem is that the cells are not able to make energy efficiency, and that's why they become C-word cells. And so if you give what is necessary for the cells in general to produce energy efficiently and properly again, then they will shift out of that state. And so there's different kind of strategies that have come from that. Different people have taken different things from it. For instance, there's the Gerson Institute, who are like, well, it's those cells burn a lot of glucose, so the thing to do is to not give them glucose. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing Gerson Institute. Anyway, there's definitely a school of thought that says that. So just stop having glucose, go onto a lower carbohydrate, certainly low simple sugar diet, and you will stop feeding the C-word cells. That's their idea of it. So the Ray Peat kind of school of thought is obviously very different from that. It's carbohydrates are not the problem. In fact, carbohydrates are the best source of fuel. That's their position. The problem is that the cells are not able to utilize it correctly. And so that's where adding in things like the B vitamins and aspirin would make sense, potentially helping the cells to utilize that carbohydrate correctly. An obvious candidate for that would be B1, and I think that is one of the ones talked about in this particular community. I think B1, B3, and B7 off the top of my head that they're currently doing studies on. But yeah, almost all the B vitamins, B2 as well, could potentially be B5, could potentially be utilized to help that energy production work better. So that's the theory behind it. I think there probably is some truth to that. I think the idea of, I'm not going to do any other treatments other than that, if I have that problem, I probably wouldn't go that route, but I can understand that it's definitely worth doing research in that area.
Yeah, I agree. Having done, as I talked about extensively, the NutriVal, finding out, how many B vitamins are absolutely essential for most processes in the body, and also, nutrients and nutrient deficiencies is number 2 on the Rejuvenate blueprint. I mean, look at it; it's genetics, and then it's nutrients. It makes a massive difference, because if you don't have the ingredients that you need to function correctly, something's going to break down. And the body is this amazing mechanism that, well, if I don't have enough, I'll find another way. But then that other way is going to potentially produce side effects that we don't want.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you can also understand too, like you just said about how people would then say, "Oh, well, then it's carbs are the problem," which also brings me into, another one on the list that we can easily flow into, I believe, which is, we talk about carbs and type 2 diabetes. Well, here, this one is sugar reverses type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. I think the clip from that is probably the most popular and also just controversial, like just the amount of comments per view. There's like a massive, and it's people arguing mainly with each other in the comment section about that particular theory that when I explained that one. Um, as some of the critics have pointed out, the evidence for that is not super abundant. Studies that were, quoted are fairly old. Um, and so, but, there are people, doing maybe not clinical studies, but their own personal experiments with this still, and some claiming success. Overall, again, it's not what I would do. I mean, I don't know when it will come out exactly, but I'm happy to say I've got her permission to do it. My wife, after quite a few stressful months for reasons that personal reasons she may or may not want to go into when the episode of her and you comes out, Chrissy, had gotten to a place of being pre-diabetic, so insulin, fairly high insulin resistance. I did not outline for her a course of a sugar diet to reverse that. And I know it's not the same, it's pre-diabetic, it's not diabetic, but I guess even more illustrative that even when it was only pre-diabetic, it's not what I consider the correct course of action. So you can watch that episode to find out what I actually did recommend to her. But she basically reversed it. She went from pre-diabetic insulin and glucose levels to pretty much optimal levels in 4 weeks. 5 weeks. Although she wasn't really implementing what I said the first week or two, so it's debatable. But let's say 5 weeks was from test to test, and sugar consuming any sugar was not part of the protocol. So,
And should we define sugar just so people will understand? Yeah.
Well, he meant like actual refined sugar. Now, not only that, he also talked about orange juice and various other fruits, especially he was a fan of. But yeah, he absolutely did talk about refined sugar as a part of that, and the studies do as well. To be fair, like as I said, admittedly a bit sparse and old. So it's not the strategy that I would utilize probably with anyone, to be honest. But do I believe that it's possible? Also, yes, because I think there is definitely truth, and I see more and more evidence of it in the mainstream, that it is free fatty acids which significantly contribute to insulin resistance. So I can see, one of the ideas of having like a very high carbohydrate diet with actually minimal fats could theoretically work. But by Pete's own admission, the main fats that are causing the problem are the unsaturated fats. And so I don't really see why you have to choose between either a diet full of unsaturated fats or a diet with very high carbs and no fats. Like, what about the third option? What about the third option of just high quality saturated fats that are much less likely to cause that issue, even if those fats are in their free fatty acid form in the blood? And so people have their arguments about that, about the Randall cycle, that if you have moderate amounts of carbs and fat, that the body struggles more with it than if you have mainly fat or mainly carbs as a fuel. I understand the theory of that, but just in practice, and hopefully my wife will do that recording testimonial, as a case study, as an example of that. In practice, it's just not true. If you have the right type of fats and you have the right type of carbohydrates and you have sufficient protein and you're eating the right type of day and all of that stuff, it just works. And to be honest, this is one of the areas where my where my approach is not that far from the kind of mainstream. Like the kind of moderate levels of things is not a million miles away. Now, admittedly, I'm saying to have different stuff, right? Like I'm saying not to have vegetable oils and all the rest of it. But I realize that my perspective is a little bit mainstream, but I'm not trying to be controversial, counterculture at every opportunity. I'm just always trying to find the truth. I'm trying to find what works. And in this case, what I see working is moderate levels of exactly the right thing at appropriate times.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's something that we've discussed even in for myself, of finding the right fuel
Yep.
for my body. Yeah, because there's a lot of confusing information out there too. And that's also too why it's nice to have conversations around this, because somebody could be like, oh, that's it. I could just eat as many donuts as I want and reverse my type 2 diabetes because sugar can fix it. But,
I know you say that the pro-sugar people immediately say, donuts are not sugar, they're full of
right.
bad
You got the
fats.
fat and everything else. Yeah.
I even
Yeah.
got criticism for the thumbnail I used for the sugar as a superfood video. The fact that the woman on there had like cakes and pastries in front of her, and they're like, that's not sugar. That's it's like, okay. I was just trying to come up with a thumbnail that got people interested. I admit that isn't, what Pete was actually recommending by any means. So yeah, I'm just going to add to that to say, here's my other point on it. Even if I end up being dead wrong, that actually the better way to treat it is either a high carb diet or a high fat diet because of the Randall cycle. Here's why I'm still probably not going to modify my advice. Not because I'm stubborn, but because here's the thing. My advice also works, even if some would say it takes longer or whatever, but this is the difference. My advice is sustainable. It's extremely difficult long term to stick to almost no fat or almost no carbs. Sure, there are a handful of people do it. Some of the influencers who say they're doing it are doing it. Some of them are not. Some of them are just lying. I know, behind the scenes. I'm not saying all of them are, but I'm saying I know some of them are. I know most of the time, if people don't have a professional reputation or whatever to defend, that they don't lie about it. They just admit that they've changed their mind. Most people don't stick to it that long, and so I'm not only trying to find something that works, I'm trying to find something that works that is sustainable long term. So that's also why I don't, back to the original point, that's also why I don't, treat it that way. Like, even if it were effective, which I think is debatable, the point is it's not sustainable long term to have this very, very, very low fat diet for most people.
No, I agree, because sustainable, that's the key, is that creating success, because anybody that puts themselves into deprivation, they will go back at some point. The pendulum is going to swing.
Yep. And you say deprivation again, I can hear their voices, and when it's like, you're not depriving yourself of anything, carbohydrate is the only fuel you need, blah, blah, blah. It's, as long as you're having some of the protein, the non-inflammatory amino acids. I get that that's the argument, but what Chris is talking about is like psychologically, right?
Yes, thank you.
Socially, like, because you're right. Like, deprivation is basically, if I can't, eat what everyone else is eating, then I'm probably not going to stick to it. That's just the reality of how most people operate. So we have to, face and help people as they are, not as we wish they should be.
Well said. So sticking with the diabetes thing, there was one of these that popped out to me as well, which is cortisol causes diabetes.
Again, I don't know if Pete ever said that, but I'm sure he said it's a contributing factor at the very least, because it is. He's 100% right. I think we even addressed that on the cortisol episode. So very recently, we recorded that quite recently. I very recently dug into all that. Absolutely is a contributing factor. It's not disputed. I'm not sure if Dr. Pete was the first person to identify it, but he may well have been. But now it is, well known among those, who look into it, and not really even controversial. Now, causes obviously is always a problem, because it's very rarely one cause, one effect. There's a bunch of different contributing factors and a bunch of different effects, but it's a significant contributing factor. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so
And sorry, elevated cortisol. I mean, not the
yes,
existence of cortisol, just to
no.
clarify that as well.
No,
But
because
yeah,
we all have cortisol. It just do we have different levels, and there's different stresses that we're having as well in the body, and like you said,
chronically elevated.
chronically elevated. Yeah.
And just to tie them together, so the reason is, one of the reasons is chronically elevated cortisol increases the level of free fatty acids that are released into the bloodstream, and then those free fatty acids create insulin resistance, and then insulin resistance is pre-diabetes. So, there you go. There are other mechanisms, I remember, but that's the kind of obvious one that ties back to what we were just discussing.
Can you repeat that cycle one more time just so it really lands?
Cortisol increases the level of free fatty acids. Free fatty acids contribute to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is pre-diabetes.
Perfect. Yeah, it's that thing too. Which we had discussed and in depth, and I'll make sure I put that link if it has been released before or after. I'll make sure it's in the description one way or another. That that waking up at midnight, between in the middle of the night, sometimes that can be due to high cortisol, your body spiking its adrenaline, which then releases the glucose. All of those things. So, like you said, it's not just one thing, but there are some other knock-ons that occur.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
All right, another one coming. Now, this one, CO2 oxygenates tissue.
Yeah. Again, discovered in 1904. It's called the Bohr effect. 100% true. I remember debating like a top cardiologist on this. I probably mentioned this before, not publicly, just some marketing meeting, I think, over lunch. And his conclusion in the end was like, okay, that is how it works, and I was but like they just skip over it. Like I don't really understand, like they can't it's a physiological fact, so they don't really argue with it. So what they do is they just diminish the relevance and importance of it.
Why do you think they do that?
Well, that's what they're taught to do. I felt like I was talking to brainwashing. Why are they told to do that is a big question that's quite interesting. It kind of depends on your, psychological bent of character. Probably the most conspiracy-ish answer is that there has been a real attempt over the last many decades to demonize carbon dioxide in general. They act as if it is going to, lead to the apocalypse, literally. I mean, what I don't know, Satan's legions used to be 200 years ago to 2,000 years ago. Now, like CO2 is in its place, right? It is the thing that's going to destroy the earth and destroy us all. So of course, it complicates that narrative a little bit if they're like, well, it's going to lead to our extinction and the apocalypse, but it is actually really necessary for every cell in the body. It makes people want to scratch their head a little bit more. Oh, that's weird. And it is actually necessary for plants to grow. And in fact, as the CO2 levels have risen, so has the level of plant life on the earth. And, when I was young and environmentalists in the 80s, they were talking about deforestation and forests being cut down and the rest of it, which is a really bad thing and a really big problem. And there's now more forest then than there were in the 80s, despite all the cutting down of trees to make way for livestock and industry and this and that and the other. And the primary reason, the only real reason why it's gone up despite all the chopping down of trees is because of the increase in CO2. And so these kind of facts get in the way of that narrative. And then you see that the whole increased the carbon credits and you can pay money to offset your CO2 and and then there's even we need to restrict people's movement to reduce their CO2, and it just seems like it's all part of that agenda of tyranny that we've talked about before, to me, even if there is some truth to it. And so let's say that it's true, the theory of CO2 and all the rest of it, everything that's taught. I don't even want to say the words CC because I don't want to trigger some, I don't know, algorithm. But let's say it's true, all of it. Okay, but when inconvenient facts like the two I just mentioned, every cell in your body is dependent on CO2 for oxygen to get to it, and every plant life on this planet is dependent on it, and the levels of it determine the level of plant growth. And we generally like plants, right? And we like trees and all the rest of it.
Yes, very much
That
so. Very much
yeah.
so.
Then like if the agenda were genuinely to help and not to kind of control the narrative towards a specific kind of usually tyrannical outcome, then why can't we just debate all the facts openly? So anyway, that was Elwin's controversial view. But yeah, that's my view on probably why CO2 is demonized, like when it comes up, right? Because it may well be that someone, often these things are accidental initially. Someone de-emphasized it, and then by the time they realized it was already being taught a certain way, and once you're going down a certain path, it's quite difficult to change course when it's whole institutions and policies and blah, 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 blah. But I suspect that the reason why it's still treated that way, despite, the overwhelming evidence, is probably political, if I had to guess.
Oh, you might not be wrong, Owen. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that you just think of. You're correct. It's just a byproduct. It doesn't have a use, but of course, but yes, it does. There is definitely a feedback loop in there, and it's those things that you figure out later on. It's like, oh, there's this cycle. Oh, the body does this, so then that has that reaction over here, or that signals that to do that, and then we come back full circle. And it's just, yeah, like you said, it's just diminished or pushed aside, but no, there is very great validity to it.
Absolutely, yeah, and it comes from Buteyko. Pete, there's obviously an episode about Pete, but I did an episode on Buteyko as well. He's this Russian scientist. I won't explain it all again, but he felt like he could cure all disease by increasing people's CO2 levels. Maybe that was a bit of an overreach, but certainly, they did a bunch of studies on its effectiveness for a lot of different issues, and it helped a lot of different people with a lot of different issues. And it's all just ignored. I mean, there is also the possibility, again, different political conspiracy. This was all Russian research, and the Cold War, there was a huge kind of West versus Russia kind of thing going on. I guess there still is, bizarrely. But like anything that they said would be obviously diminished, and everything we came up with would be enhanced in our own culture. I guess it was, the obverse was true for them. And although Buteyko was hardly championed by the USSR, I think he was persecuted, despite having, prestigious role initially and all the rest of it, and never really being, he wasn't like Wilhelm Reich or something. He wasn't thrown in prison, but there were certainly factions that didn't like what he was saying. Nonetheless, the perception in the West may have been this is a Russian theory, this is a Russian modality, and therefore we don't believe it. It could be as simple as tribalistic as that.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, that of my enemies, like, oh, do we trust it or do we just disregard it, move into what we believe over here and just think it's something else, which doesn't always, I understand that thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and I doubt that the USSR was a super trustworthy source of information either. I'm not saying that they were, but just, like, truth is truth. And that's the great thing about what Pete recognized. He didn't care where the truth came from. He just tried to work out what's true.
So the next one I am going to take us to is DHT does not cause hair loss. And so, I mean, this is also something like as people are maturing, especially women, it's not just in men, hormones are changing, things are happening, hair might be thinning or shedding or things like that. So, there's a lot of blame that goes to DHT.
Yeah, I mean, mainly for men, to be honest, with the DHT. So, I mean, this... I would say the focus on not DHT. Danny Roddy, probably one of Dr. Pete's friends and students, was, he wrote a book about this, Hair Like a Fox, I think. Really all about this subject. But I'm not saying it wasn't from Pete, but I'm saying Danny Roddy probably really popularized it. And, the basic idea being it's not as simple as that. It's fundamentally down to the thing that Dr. Peat said like all diseases down to. And in fact, yeah, let's talk about that now. At this point, why not? It's this basic idea of lack of energy, lack of mitochondrial energy, lack of metabolic energy. From Dr. Peat's point of view, getting your energy levels back up, getting to a level of optimal energy production, which was usually reflected by the metabolic rate, which was reflected by things like the basal body temperature and heart rate, was the goal. And so anything that led to that outcome, he generally was a fan of. Anything that detracted from that, he generally was against. Go back to CO2, it's another example. Higher CO2 levels in the body would tend to increase metabolism. And so from, Pete and Roddy's point of view, and I agree with them, it's really lack of cellular energy. That's the issue. And so, people occasionally ask, why are you Bordeaux? And I think I've talked about that in an episode before. I won't do it again. But yeah, I agree, lack of cellular energy. It certainly wasn't excess of DHT, because when I tested my DHT levels, they were really low. And I have this genetic tendency for DHT to be low. So yeah, to me, it's not as simple as that. Some people say, oh, it's actually estrogen. Well, estrogen's generally always actually also been fairly low. Although, who knows, I guess, with tissue levels with both of them. But anyway, I think that the thing of lack of energy makes more sense. And it makes sense that when your body has lack of energy, it prioritizes the more essential functions and deprioritizes what it considers less essential functions. And hair is just one of those things that's obviously, less essential. Now, that's obviously only part of the picture, admittedly, because most men, especially as they get older, they get more hairy in general, and it's only at the top of their head that it's lacking. So, the other piece of the picture is often patterns of chronic tension that then reduce blood flow. And so that, in a combination of a lower energy state, means there's not enough energy to push the nutrients and sufficient basically nutrients through, despite the lack of blood flow, and then the areas that have the lower blood flow then suffer. So I think there's some evidence for this. Like I know I have this extreme lack of hair at the top of my head, but I actually don't have the kind of thing at the back at all, circle there. I only have it at the front. So in the Norwood scale, I'm kind of a weird one. I'm quite, recede at the front, but 0 at the back. So technically, I'm quite early on the balding scale, only because I've got 0 loss at the back, only the front. Anyway, so I think, that probably just shows that I have a different pattern of tension from average with people with male pattern baldness. And, that's just what it's really about. It's about that combination. Now, that's off the top of my head. Pun intended, pun not intended. If you want to hear the full story of that theory, as I said, Danny Rolling's book I think it's easy to read, well written. He explains it in detail, and I basically agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we do have one more in depth in our arsenal of episodes, so I'll try and find that and put the link below as well. So moving on to our next one. In a pro-metabolic state, you can live 3 years in one.
I don't know if he actually said that, but yeah, that general concept of you live a lot more life when you are creating an optimal amount of energy is hardly a new concept, This concept of pro-metabolic and optimizing your energy production, Dr. P obviously approached it from a certain angle, but we have to remember this is, the same concept as things like the Taoists talking about optimizing your level of qi and maybe jing as well, qing qi. And if you do that, then, there's claims you can live hundreds of years, you can perform supernatural feats, and certainly, if you don't believe any of that stuff, you're a lot healthier for a lot longer than the average person. So there's always been this concept in all kinds of healing and optimization systems throughout history. I think the Ayurvedic and the Taoists are the most obvious, but that's because they were quite good at keeping written records. But I'm sure there are other cultures as well. and I know of a few of them, but they're more obscure, who all had this idea: optimize energy production, you will optimize health, you will live longer, you will have less disease, you will age more slowly, at least. And so, yeah, the idea that you can not just get more done in a year or in a day, but like live more life is an interesting one. And so, when people say, time is going quickly, I feel like that's because people are not doing much. They're not living much life, like, I'm not saying that I'm not even saying that my life is that action packed, especially not anymore. I don't travel much. But I don't know, it just feels like I've lived a lot of life. Like a lot has happened. When people say, God, can you believe the year's gone by so quickly? I'm like, so much has happened. Like I've had so much go on. Like, yes, it feels like longer in a way, not in a bad way, but like
Oh, I kind of have had a different experience. I don't know. I mean, because geez, I've lived a very, very full life with lots going on, but there's times when, just especially with having kids that now are pretty much fully grown, that I'm like, where did that time go? It seems like yesterday that they were so little and I was walking them to school, but today they're all off on their own jobs, driving their cars, doing things like that. And I just can't believe that 20 years has passed. But I mean, it was definitely busy. So I don't know.
busy is not the same as full.
Right.
Yeah, it's not the same at all. So when we say pro-metabolic, it's the opposite of a stress state. So the more stressed you are, the more time does pass quickly, and the more it does seem like where has time gone. It's and this is like it's not a criticism of you. I mean, it's a luxury. I've created a fairly luxurious position for myself where I don't have a lot of the demands. Like I never wake up with an alarm clock. Like there's all kinds of things. And part of it is maybe to my detriment, right? I don't have children, so I know that would create a lot more demands on me. For instance, I understand, but just I guess the central concept is that. Yeah, if anything, the more not the more relaxed you are, but the more, just I guess high energy you are. And high energy is not the same as busy. Like it's not exactly the opposite, but it's closer to the opposite than it is to being the same.
I understand that. That's a really good distinction because, yes, I mean, like when we first met, oh, I was so stressed. I mean, I'm much less stressed now than I was then, but there's still a good degree of stress there that I'm working on. So that's a really great distinction, though. So I'm glad that you said that pro-metabolic state is not a stress state. Would you equate it to more like of living in the moment, or well, some people call it flow or other things like that? Or is that very different as well?
I think so. Yes, I would equate pro-metabolic state to a state of flow. I think maybe I led us down the wrong path there. We're talking about like thinking back, because I think it's also just based on memory, to be honest. So I think the better someone's memory is, like, because if I think of it between now and exactly a year ago, I remember loads of stuff,
Right.
and maybe you don't. And so then you perceive it differently for that reason. Now, the ability to remember well is an example of a pro-metabolic state, but so is a full head of hair. Like different things show up in different people in different ways, and there's a significant genetic component to it, right? So genetically, I'm more likely to lose hair. Genetically, I'm more likely to have a good memory. So maybe there's a memory component to it. So yeah, I think maybe I led us down the wrong path there. I think the thing you said about the flow state, and yeah, often when people are in this flow state, they absolutely do like have this where has the time gone. It's a hard thing to explain.
Yeah, it's definitely one for contemplation because time is a funny thing. It's like I remember in March there was something we were doing, and that seems like so long ago compared to where we are now. But like the kids being so little, it seems like no time has passed. So it's a very odd thing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think presence might be a big part of it, like what you just said. You know that Adam Sandler movie, Click, I think it was called, where Like he kept wanting to fast forward periods of life to get through the kind of boring stuff, the work or whatever. And then he kind of looks back at it eventually and he's like, I just like missed a lot of my life. I wasn't present for it because I was just in this kind of, obviously the metaphor in the movie is fast forwarding. We were remote, but the idea of being not present, just kind of busy, just getting through it. And I think it requires, not requires. It's a lot easier to be present when you have more metabolic energy, and it's a lot more difficult to not be.
Okay. No, I'm glad we had that little discussion. That's good because it's brought up a few different things and some clarity.
Yeah. So I think in a flow state, when you're achieving something, yes, time does pass quickly, but I think when you're very present, you retain and remember more, and then when you look back, it seems like a lot has happened. So it's kind of converse, I guess. Yeah, it's hard to say. But anyway, the idea of 3 days in one really opened up a can of worms there. I don't even know what that person who came up with that meant. I don't think that's a direct Ray Peat quote. I don't know if they meant that you can achieve 3 times as much, which is almost certainly is true. Because the thing is, when you're in a high energy state and specifically not in a stress state, you're not necessarily as busy. You might be less busy, but you do achieve more because you're not wasting time. And a lot of achievement is about decisions, not activity. And so, I know that everything that I've achieved has almost always been the result of making the right decisions, as opposed to working hard. And the very, very most successful people do a lot of both. Like Elon Musk, I guess, richest person in the world, very hard worker, made very good decisions in aggregate in general. Obviously you could argue with some of them. I certainly could, but just in terms of achievements, let's just say, obviously made good decisions in the sense of having achieved a lot. And so, whereas for me, I think because I've had different, health challenges, which I've been transparent about, any achievements I've had have been more making the right decisions rather than working hard, because I often haven't had the energy to work as hard as someone like Elon Musk. So the point I was going to make is both of those are dependent on a pro-metabolic state, but good decisions far more. Like you can work really hard even if you're not in a pro-metabolic state by being in a highly stressed state. And for some people, most people, they can only do that for a certain amount of time before they collapse, have a breakdown, something like that. Some people who are very strong or, have very strong will or a very strong mission can kind of override that and keep themselves in a stress state for decades. But most people can't, honestly, is my... and that's generally the strategy that is pursued to achieve significant achievement or success, and most people fail. And I think the reason is because most people, they run out of steam. They just can't keep up with it. But I would say good decision making is essentially dependent on not being in a stress state. Joe Dispenza, we've talked about in the past, explains this very well. Like you cannot, to make a good decision, you have to perceive clearly. And to perceive clearly, you have to be out of the fight or flight state. Like it's when you're in a fight or flight state, your perceptual range is significantly narrowed. You just get tunnel vision, you get blinkered. And actually, I think Dr. Peat talks about this concept as well. And so to make good decisions, you first of all have to be able to think clearly and to see the big picture. And to think clearly and see the big picture, you have to be able to relax, at least sometimes, and be present as well. Like live in the real world, not in, your memories or your fantasies, your imagination, your fears, all of this kind of stuff. You have to kind of be in the real world. And so, a lot of that, requires energy. And so I think definitely in terms of being able to achieve 3 times as much in a day, I achieve way more when I'm relaxed and in a high energy state than when I'm not, even if I'm not as busy.
Absolutely. So listeners, if you have some comments about that, or tell us your thoughts and your opinions on this one, and let us know in those
If we get a lot of
comments.
views, I know that'll maybe, along with the sugar thing being the most debated thing about the time thing, because no one seems to agree on that.
Well, here we're moving into the next one. GNG/ketosis are adaptations to starvation, not biohacks.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I see sometimes these things about like, what was it recently? Someone on some famous person's podcast measuring everyone's ketones and giving them like a score based on how high their level of ketosis is. And it's just absurd to me. And it's absurd not because of I agree with a different theory. It's absurd because of my real life lived experience, which is throughout most of the time when I was really sick, my ketones were really high. So that so-called expert would have gone and gone, oh, look at you, your
You're doing
ketosis.
great.
Yeah, your blood glucose is low, your ketones are high. Well done. Keep it. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, to me, there's no validity to that being a universal standard of achievement. Now, are there certain situations and conditions where it is preferable to be in a state of ketosis? Absolutely. You know, and there is a genetic component to it again, but yeah, it overall, it is an adaptation to starvation. Of course, it is. Now, the argument from the people who are a fan of it could say, okay, but it's a good one and it's beneficial and it's better and you should do it often. And that's the thing that's more debatable. And I did, an episode on this recently when we talked about fasting. So I refer people to that episode to hear both sides. I try my best to give both sides before I give a measured. It wasn't quite about ketosis, but it was about fasting in general, which always leads to ketosis. So it's very related. So yeah, I basically agree with Dr. Peat on this.
Sorry to jump in. Yeah, there's another one in here that says fasting can do more harm than good. Autophagy can be achieved in the euthyroid fed state, and in such a state will be more selective. Because I think, because I think that was as well that podcast where I was talking about ketones, and that sparked a conversation between you and I going like, well, wait a minute, is that the only state where this can be achieved? Am I missing out by not being in this at certain periods of time or doing things? And then we had this chat. But I loved actually what you just said, is that you said the universal standard of achievement. Like because I just thought, well, there has to be other ways too that our bodies are achieving this. And there's that whole ketosis fasting debate, like should we be, and then just becomes this for me especially, or I'm sure other people out there going like, what am I supposed to be doing? What am I supposed to be doing?
Of course. It's tricky. The main thing, and I emphasize this over and over again, is you have to test, not guess. You have to measure results. But of course, the challenge is test what, right? And so, if, as you just said, if you're testing your level of ketosis, this Brian Johnson guy who's very famous for trying to pioneer longevity, which I think is great, and he does some great work. But, he puts out these test results sometimes and he's, I'm in the top 1% of this. And, one of them was like, he has such a low body temperature, which means he's in the top 1%. And I'm like, so see, this is someone taking my obviously he didn't get it from me, but this is someone taking my philosophy and completely corrupting it from my point of view, because yes, I'm a big fan of testing, but I'm also a big fan of, trying to be reasonable with the criteria for testing. And that's not easy to do. I'm not knocking him for that. Maybe he'll end up coming to the same conclusions I did. Maybe I'll end up coming to the same conclusions as him. Who knows? But yeah, the idea that, the more ketosis, the better, is an interesting one. And as I said, there are certain conditions where it is true, demonstrably, provably, but it doesn't mean it's always true for everyone. And again, there's that genetic component to it, right? And this is when you and I had the conversation. I said, look, even though you have very early signs of insulin resistance, it's really not that bad, but it's there. It doesn't mean that you need to be on this low carbohydrate diet. And your genetics actually say that you do well with carbohydrates, and so. And the proof of it is in what leaves you actually satiated when it comes to food, right? And and then we'll talk about this probably in the next episode we record. I don't know when it will come out, but if you're not satiated with the amount of calories that you need for your basal metabolism, like every day, not just some days, then you're having the wrong combination of stuff. No matter what I say, no matter what Dr. Peat says, no matter what keto influencer says, like, you got to find the right combination for you. And so, when it comes to food, that's the ultimate arbiter to me. So again, I am a big fan of lab test results, but if your insulin is low, or your ketones are high, or your glucose is low, or whatever you've been told you need to achieve, but in order to get to that, you've eaten in a way which leaves you unsatisfied, and sometimes you break it. And I remember reading another person's book on, I think it was on chronic fatigue. I'll say who, yeah, Dr. Sarah Myhill. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. And she was talking about being on this, ketosis diet, not for weight loss, not for blood sugar balance, but for chronic fatigue. And there's this chapter on, and it was like, we all know it's so hard to stick to, and I'm not perfect, and I break it myself sometimes, but da da da. And I'm like, if it's so, like, my diet isn't hard to stick to at all. Like, I never feel like I haven't eaten enough. Like, and nor should yours be, whatever yours is, even if yours is very different from mine. Like, you should, and I don't gain any weight that I don't want to gain. And, these days, I'm happy to say I don't lose any weight that I don't want to lose, though I was before. And that's how it should be for everyone. And sure, it's more difficult for some people than it is for me. Absolutely. That's the thing about genetics again. For some people, some things are harder for some people than others. And that's the way it is. And, we have to accept that as well. But this idea of, this thing that we're trying to achieve is so hard to stick to that even me, the one who's teaching it and telling everyone they have to follow it 100%, I can't do it 100%. And, and I'm not knocking her, because at least she was being honest, which a lot of these people aren't, which is, as I was saying, I appreciate the honesty, but it does make me think. And, I've seen this with vegans as well. I've had, like, people, in the vegan, and I can't stick to 100%, but, like, the fruitarians, I remember, and I see them eating cashew cheese at, a live event or something like that, and they're telling everyone else not to eat fats. And it's just like, if you can't, but again, I'm not judging their lack of willpower or anything. What I'm judging is their philosophy that this extremism is optimal when it is patently not actually sustainable and realistic. Like, anything that you have to put, any diet that you have to put such an effort into in order to stick to is not the right diet. Like, I put no effort to sticking to mine at all, other than the effort of making my own food. Like, that's the only effort I go to. And that's just the way that it should be. And by the way, Hannah, who hopefully that episode will be out soon if it's not already, she did a little bit of effort of just changing what she was used to. But again, no deprivation, no, oh God, no cheat day, no wishing she could cheat day, all of this kind of stuff. Like, it has to be sustainable, and the sustainability comes from it being genuinely satiating.
That is a really good point, because it's also too, it's like you have to enjoy it. And I think that's where that genuinely satiating part comes from, because you're like, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. It's slightly different. I mean, enjoyment can also just come, if you're making your own food, it comes down to, like, knowing the basics of how to make food tasty, which often is just like like my friend Russell James, who used to be the raw chef. Now I think he's still chefing, but kind of teaching more balanced food. He always said FASS, FASS, fatty acid sour sweet. Like, so basically, if your food doesn't taste good, it's always because it's, like, missing one of those tastes. And usually it's just as simple as salt, to be honest. Like, the right level of salt. I learned this as a chef. I saw so many chefs put so much effort into preparing meals, doing chopping little things and sprinkling and all the rest of it. And then, like, it would come competition time, and then the judges would just say bland. like hours and hours of work just for nothing, all because they didn't just put the correct level of salt in, which then brings out all the flavor. It's not only salt. If you add salt in and then it's like, not nice, not nice. Oh, now it's too salty. Then you're missing something else. And that something else is usually one of the other ones. It's lack of sour, a little bit of sour taste, lack of sweetness. And again, sweetness doesn't have to be extreme, it make like just a little bit sometimes is all that's required. And then fattiness. And if you don't want to actually have fat, which again, I'm saying you probably should have at least some degree, but there are other things that can create the sensation of fattiness without it actually being fat, like a creaminess. But yeah, like those tastes, what I just said is what we all like. Some of us like other stuff. Some of us like bitter tastes in certain circumstances, like chocolate or whatever. Some of us like spicy tastes in certain circumstances. But we all like those four if it's the right level. And so I think that's the other thing as well. If, people go from like eating, I don't know, McDonald's, where, a whole team of scientists have been engineering the food to be, last as long as possible and be the exact right balance of those different factors to make it as palatable as possible, as well as all the cheating with chemicals, etc. But they're still, you can be damn sure that those fries that they're giving you have got the right level of salt in to make them as tasty as possible. They haven't forgotten the salt there. And they go from that to then, eating healthy, and then they're eating whatever they're eating, but they're not like doing these simple things to make their food palatable. So I'd say that is the other thing. Like if we're talking about taste, when I'm talking about satiation, I'm just talking about afterwards, do I feel like I still want to eat? But when we're talking about enjoyability, then that's more just about those kind of factors, I would say. If you've ever said something like, I've tried everything to lose weight and nothing works, then this message is for you. Hi, I'm Owen Robinson here from the Rejuvenate podcast. Most people think that difficulty losing weight is about willpower or calories or exercise, and the truth is it's not. It's usually one or more of 5 hormonal imbalances that are blocking you losing weight. That's why Dr. Miriam Mikitsky and I created the Hormetics Weight Optimization System, a simple quiz that pinpoints your type, then matches you to the exact formula you need. Right now, we're launching the Leptin Balance Formula, and this is specifically formulated by Dr. Miriam and I, exactly for people who have this leptin resistance, which makes it very difficult for them to feel satiated by food. It's packed with African mango, Ceylon cinnamon, and alpha-lipoic acid, ingredients shown in numerous scientific studies to help your brain finally hear the I'm full, I'm satiated signal, so you can stop thinking about food. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/leptin, order now, and you'll be invited to join our clinical study the moment you check out. There's no cost for this, and you can track exactly how well it works for you, and you can get 20% off now by using code REJUVENATE at checkout. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/leptin and use code REJUVENATE for 20% off now. You deserve to feel satiated again.
So the next one on the list, this is an interesting one. Being cold makes you stupid.
Yeah. Well, it depends on your definition of stupid, right? Like, does it reduce your IQ significantly? Not significantly, right? You're not going to take a highly intelligent, high IQ person and call them down and suddenly they're, a low IQ person. That's not going to happen. I guess Brian Johnson's an example of that, massively reduced his core metabolism, still a high IQ person. But if you define stupidity as, intelligence, like as in what is IQ and intelligence? I just define it as processing speed and ability to handle complexity of information. That's all. Now, if you define stupid as a lack of wisdom or a lack of good judgment, then absolutely, for the reasons I kind of went over earlier, which is you have to be out of a stress state in order to not make stupid decisions. Does being out of a stress state guarantee you won't make stupid decisions? No, because you may still not have correct information. You may have bad environmental programming. There's lots of reasons we can and are all stupid sometimes, including me. But like, to maximize your chance of not being stupid, putting yourself into a stress state gets in the way of that. So getting yourself out of a stress state isn't where you're in a best position, given all your resources, given your IQ, given your life experience, given your environment, given your programming, given your everything. You're most likely to make a good decision rather than a stupid decision if you are out of a stress state and in a high energy state. So by that definition, I 100% agree. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, it's like, yeah, you first and foremost, you have to define the definition, which you clearly did, which makes a very valid point. And then, yeah, that goes into stress or not stress state, which we've already talked about. When people are stressed and things are going on, it's just too much, and you just don't have the wherewithal or the space to take it all in, see the big picture, as you said before, and make that good decision. So yeah, it can make you really, really dumb.
Yeah. And this is the problem with, narcissists and psychopaths and all the rest of it we talked about in that episode a while ago. And I realized that labels thrown around far too freely these days, but, people do exist who very much fall in that category. And one of the things that expert at is always keeping you in a highly stressed state so that you make bad decisions. And so that you don't know what decision to make, and then they can kind of control what decisions you make, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. So then again, that goes back into checking where you are, taking that moment. And if you feel like you're in that anxious state, it's like, and I have a decision to make, maybe I need to reassess and take a moment.
Absolutely. And, the idea of sleeping on it is always good for any major decision, because what does that imply? Well, you've at least relaxed enough to fall asleep, so even if you're generally a highly strung person, you've at least had some period of time where you were less stressed, where your brain was able to process it at a less stressed state and maybe get to a better decision than if you had have just acted impulsively.
So true. So true. Well, I think that also goes, because sometimes, especially if somebody throws out a question at you, I'll say to my husband, just tell him you'll think about it, and we'll tell him tomorrow as well, because sometimes I don't know exactly what state we're in that moment, and I'd hate to make a rash decision and realize tomorrow when I woke up going, I really wish I hadn't said yes to that.
100%. It's tricky because some people are trying to push you into making a decision for bad reasons, but sometimes, like in sales, if you're selling something you really believe in, you want to help someone, that a lot of the time if someone says, I'll think about it, like they may mean it at the time, but they forget, they get distracted. And so, you want them to make a decision more quickly. But yeah, the reality is that, you've got to let people go and let them fly away, see if they've come back to you, let them make that decision in their own time.
It's very true, because then, what is it? The people that you retain, if they do that, are probably going to be more loyal than if not.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I agree. And it's never wise, even if you're selfish, really, to push people into making a decision like before they really want to. Like, it always backfires on you. And this is why, especially narcissists to some degree as well, psychopaths, that they are the victim of their own machinations often. Like it isn't actually a good idea to push people into things that they don't want to do or they're not ready to do or whatever. It very rarely leads to a happy, peaceful life. Even if you might end up with more money or more power, you're not going to end up with more enjoyment or satisfaction in life.
So our next one that we're going to, this next theory that we are looking at, serotonin is a hormone of subservience, stress coping, pattern seeking, and torpor.
Yeah, I think it's torpor.
Torpor. Yeah, I can't pronounce it.
Yeah, it's a barely used word. I think learned helplessness is what it's pointing to.
Lethargy, something like that. Yeah. Or something different. Is that
torpor is also related to lethargy. But I think learned helplessness would have been a better thing for them to put there, because I think that's the more interesting thing about it to me, and that's what I remember reading Pete talk about when it comes to serotonin more than anything. But yeah, the other one, subservience, stress coping, pattern seeking. We have talked about this a lot. I basically agree. Um, I don't go as far as some Pete followers do, and possibly Pete himself. I can't actually quite remember if no, I'm pretty sure. Like the lower the serotonin, the better. I don't think that's true, but I definitely agree that it's not the neurotransmitter of happiness, which it was kind of painted at. Being sold obviously as an antidepressant. I do think that it is a kind of stress coping neurotransmitter, and it's related to the dorsal vagal state, uh, like discovered or clarified, I guess, by Stephen Porges in the polyvagal theory. So the idea being that rather than when you have the sympathetic and parasympathetic, when you have the fight or flight or relax, it's like, well, if you're feeling depressed and helpless, which of those two is that, right? It's not fight or flight, and it's also not like relaxed and happy. So there must be a third state of the autonomous nervous system, and of course there is. And I agree with Pete that that third state corresponds to serotonin in the brain and central nervous system, and things that increase serotonin can make people feel better, because if you've been in a sympathetic state for a long time, if you've been in a angry or fearful state, or both, then a kind of relief into feeling more numb and shut down is a relief, but it is not an optimal state of being. The learned helplessness stuff is really interesting as well. So just briefly give an example of that. If you put a rat into like a bucket of water and it can't climb out, and if it stops swimming, it drowns. And then if you put it in there and it swims for a while, and then you pick it up and take it out again within a few minutes stay, and then you put it back in later, it will like carry on swimming for hours, like trying to stay up. Whereas if you don't do that, like it gives up a lot more quickly. So I think I explained that properly, but the concept in a nutshell, like if they know there's hope, they don't give up for a lot longer. That's the basic concept. So that feeling of lack of hope, of just giving up, correlates to serotonin in a very interesting way. And so increased serotonin correlates with that just giving up, which makes sense. So if we go back to this polyvagal theory in the dorsal vagal state, the idea of the dorsal vagal state is if that in an everyday state, which is called a ventral vagal, what we should be in most of the time, although most of us aren't, is a ventral vagal state, which is basically relaxed and alert. So both awake and present and active and able to think and focus and all the rest of it, but also relaxed, social, easygoing, happy, joyful, not stressed, not busy, not avoiding things, fighting for things, all the rest of it. So then if something comes up, then we can go into the stress state. But then if we're in the stress state too long, or if the stress state is too extreme, then we go into a shutdown state. And the most obvious example of that, which you don't see very much anymore, but in the movies where something would be so shocking that the ladies would just faint, just fall over. So obviously that does happen, right? That happens in all kinds of situations. If the input is just too much, if it's too stressful for the organism, it will just shut down. It will pass out, faint. But there is a kind of version of that which is not fully going into unconsciousness, but a much lower level of consciousness. So when first of all, when there's a threat, the body goes into an increased energy output mode to try and get out of the situation of threat. But then after a while, it does the opposite. It goes into a reduced output of energy. It's kind of giving up, but it's kind of like, it's actually the idea is that it's preserving resources, and there's very real and valid mechanisms for it. For instance, if an animal is being hunted, and let's say it's been caught, but it hasn't been eaten yet, or Maybe it hasn't even been caught, but it can't escape. There's nowhere to go. Or it's just run out of energy. It's too tired to carry on running. Then actually the smartest thing to do is to play dead. And when we say play dead, it's being completely still is one example of that, because predators tend to only see movement. So if you're completely still, often you're invisible. But then, what about the predator's already seen you? What about if the predator's, in fact, even already got you in its mouth? Well, a lot of the time, if the animal doesn't struggle, or let's say it's not in its mouth, but it's, I don't know, right in front of the predator, if it doesn't move and it doesn't run away, the predator loses interest. Because predators, yes, they hunt because they're hungry, but they don't always hunt because they're hungry. Sometimes they just hunt for practice, or even, depending on how you view these things, for fun. And so, but they may, not just hunt, but kill for fun, for practice. Like animals have this drive to chase. My dog has this, like anything that's running away from my dog, she'll chase after. Anything that's running towards my dog, she'll pretty much run away from. Like, she's extremely timid and scared, but like she'll run after a car or something if she perceives it's running away. It's so stupid. As soon as any animal, any human, anything turns around and goes to her, she'll probably then run away from it. But so So I'm just saying that maybe for slight comedy effect, but more to give that principle of like a lot of carnivorous animals or even omnivorous animals have that drive to chase, even if they're otherwise very timid animals. And so, like, basically running away, you can set that off. And certainly, also the most timid dog, if you've seen, like, when they're behind a fence, they're right, and as soon as you open the fence, they're like, I didn't mean anything. And you close the fence, and they go. So it's like even the most timid animal often is quite aggressive if they perceive threat, and if they feel it's safe to do so. So the point being, if you don't fight or flight, if you do neither, and if in fact you look like you're just dead or maybe inanimate, you're much less likely to be attacked. You're much more likely to be left alone and not eaten. So that's the mechanism and why it makes sense. Now, but of course that mechanism can go wrong, as in the case of I'm stuck somewhere and I have to keep swimming in order to stay alive and hopefully be rescued. But sometimes we might go into the shutdown mode because, oh God, I've been swimming too long. And so no one's going to come and rescue me thing would be a big factor in why we would shut down earlier, why we would give up earlier. And so the level of serotonin seems to dictate that if we do that. Now, that's not the only thing it does. We did a whole episode on it. It's higher serotonin is also correlated with narcissism and psychopathy, which we talked about earlier. That's actually one of the reasons I brought it up, because I knew we'd probably get to it later. It absolutely does correlate to higher levels of serotonin, which seems kind of what's the word, contradictory to some people, because
but we've talked about it before in the hierarchy, haven't we?
Yeah. So narcissists, psychopaths are often very low in learned helplessness in a lot of situations, right? If anything, they're massively overconfident and impulsive and all the rest of it. But what they are not still is ventral vagal. That's the point. So what they tend to do, they swing between those. And in fact, if you spend a lot of time with narcissistic and psychopathic people, yes, a lot of the time they're very on and full of energy and very sympathetic, often very entertaining or very charismatic or whatever. But they do have periods of time where they are very shut down in quite a, scary way to people who are not familiar with this phenomenon. They're not on 24/7. They often go into this very kind of withdrawn and shut down state periodically. So, and when they're being social, it's not in a genuine ventral vagal way. It's in a very, outcome oriented, manipulative, kind of sympathetic way still. And so, so I do see the correlation there still. What was the other one on the list?
Subservience, stress coping, pattern seeking.
Actually, I don't remember the pattern seeking one. I won't comment on that because I can't remember and I didn't look into that before the episode. But stress coping, yeah, I think I've explained that. It's a way of coping with stress. And yeah, the subservience as well. So this is interesting. I'll go into this for a sec. So, we talk about fight or flight, right? Now I've added another one in there, freeze, right? So that's fight, flight, or freeze. And freeze response is this highest serotonin dorsal vagal state. But there was also a fourth mode to deal with a stressful situation. And it's, if you make it an F word again, it's fawn, fawning to people, subservience. So being very subservient, being very flattering, being very agreeable, being very submissive with someone who you perceive to be more powerful is another stress response. Because if you're not stressed, even if you're walking next to someone who's way more powerful, let's say in a tribe, you're just mid-level or lower level in the tribe, you're walking next to the king or the patriarch, matriarch, whatever, you're walking. Are you going to be all on edge? Are you going to be careful, worried about what you're going to say? Are you going to, try and suck up to them, all this kind of stuff? The only reason you're going to do all that stuff is because you're stressed, because you're afraid to some degree, right? Because if you're comfortable, it's like, yeah, okay, I'm low status, they're high status, but so what? We're all part of the tribe. I acknowledge their authority, and that's it. Like, there's no need to be subservient. There's no need to be fawning unless you feel insecure, unless you feel fearful in some way. So again, it's really just pointing to the fact that high serotonin is a mechanism of the body. It's a way of coping with stress. That's what all these things have in common, which seems so different. Like being subservient, going into a kind of catatonic state, and being like a domineering narcissist. They seem like very, very different activities, but especially the last one. But what they all have in common is they're all a response to stress. And specifically, they're all a response to a level of stress which is perceived to be overwhelming. And so and they're non-standard responses, right? So the standard response is fight or flight. Those tend to correlate more to, adrenaline and noradrenaline specifically. But these non-standard responses in terms of the literature, although really, if we think about it, they're very common responses, being fawning, being agreeable, being, obnoxious and selfish as well. These are all very common occurrences we've all witnessed and probably done ourselves at some point. And these are also stress responses, but they're more serotonin related stress responses rather than purely adrenaline based stress responses. That's the point.
It's great distinctions. Yeah, really good. More a serotonin stress response than an adrenaline response. And it's nice to have those understandings too between like the subservient amount of place, or whether you are, just being in that more. What did you say that is it? The dorsal vagal.
Shut down dorsal vagal.
State.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So no, because for me as well, the more and more I look at how I am in certain situations, I can then begin to identify, oh, I was a little bit more that, oh, I was a little bit more here. So that helps me just clarify where I'm at, what's going on, so that as I move forward through it, I can understand it better and know what I need to do in future.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, there's nothing wrong with deferring to people with who you perceive as being, highly competent or authoritative in some way. I think the point is that, with these things is if it's compulsive. If you feel, no, and afterwards, like, why was I such a, or someone else is like, why were you such a, and, there's nothing wrong with, standing up for yourself or putting yourself first for once either, right? Like there are versions of all of these that are perfectly reasonable. There's nothing even, the words like futility and giving up, have a very negative connotation, I think, especially in like Western Americanized culture. But what about giving up cigarettes? Everyone's happy with that. What about seeing the futility of, I don't know, have you ever watched one of those shows like American Idol or something and gone, this person should realize it's not going to happen for them? This is, so like, it's not bad per se, none of these modes, right? It's only if they become compulsive and pathological, like they all have a place. But I think the thing that Pete was getting at is that there are certain things that make you more serotonergic, that increase your level of serotonin as a baseline, and that will increase the incidence of all these behaviors, which if they are excessive, are, pathologically definitely reducing your quality of life.
So the next theory we are going to look at is most people are somewhere on the scale of hypothyroidism.
Yeah. Well, this one makes sense from Peat's logic. So remember that the fundamental thing he's trying to do is get people in a state where they're creating an optimal amount of energy, as kind of indicated by their basal metabolic rate, indicated by their indicated by their temperature and their heart rate. And so the most obvious thing that is going to determine that is the state of the thyroid. And so if your criteria for whether someone is hypothyroid is if their TSH is over 4 or 5 or whatever, then hardly anyone has hypothyroidism. Actually, probably still more than are diagnosed with it, but still, definitely a significant minority. It's hardly anyone. It's less than 5% of people. But if your standard of hypothyroidism is anything less than 98.6 degrees or 37 degrees centigrade throughout the middle of the day, that's almost everyone these days. Especially if you remove, sometimes it's elevated temporarily by stress chemicals. So I like to get people to take their measurement after they've eaten, because as I always say, you should have more energy after you eat food, not less. But a lot of people perceive it the other way around, and that's because the stress chemicals are artificially, temporarily elevating their metabolism. But yeah, so, middle of the day after eating, if you're less than 98.6, then, you are less than optimal metabolism, which, to some degree we can put down to the thyroid. Now, different people have different takes on what it actually ultimately is. This is a hotly debated, even among my comment section, let alone the whole scientific community. But the basic point is, as Pete pointed out, that the easiest way to raise someone's metabolism, other than increasing carbohydrate intake, which he was also a big fan of, is probably, supporting thyroid function.
No, I agree with you on this one, because there's so many of us these days, it seems, we're just going slower and slower and down and down. And the people I talk to, I'm like, oh, have you, do you know what your body temperature is? Things like that. And whenever anybody comes back to me, they're definitely under the 98.6 degrees. When I look at even just my mom, she's on, her doctor's got her on thyroid. My sister, she's on thyroid. It just seems like everywhere I look around, people are on some sort of thyroid medication.
Yeah, and to be honest, when they're not, a lot of time I feel like they should be. Now, I know some people really disagree with that and they want to fix it by natural means. And if you can, great. And I think Pete was definitely not against fixing things by natural means at all. But what I would say is, first of all, our diets probably traditionally had a very small amount of thyroid hormone in them, because we would eat the next of animals, which would have thyroid hormone. And it's only very recently, in the last 100 years or so, recently from an evolutionary point of view, that's suddenly been banned and medicalized. I suppose there's still some, like chicken necks you can get, and fish, whole fish, stuff like that. But if you go to a butcher, you can ask for any part of an animal except for the thyroid gland. They'll give it to you, including any other gland. They'll give you testicles. They'll give you spleen. They'll give you even the brain, including the pituitary gland, all the rest. They'll give you everything except the thyroid gland. They're not allowed to give you the thyroid gland. So that's, something to consider. But beyond that, there are other ways you can boost the metabolism. And, Pete was a fan of coffee, for instance. Coffee does it, not for a mechanism that I like, but it does it. A very high carbohydrate diet that's lower, although not low, in protein will definitely increase the metabolism as well. There's a bunch of different things you can do, but you can increase it temporarily as well, just by going in a sauna or a hot bath or whatever. That'll temporarily increase it. And an exercise will temporarily increase it. But yeah, I think that my observation of the Ray Peat, community, fan base, whatever you might call it, is there's quite, he was fundamentally a hormone doctor, not a nutritionist. Sorry, doctor. He wasn't a medical doctor, but that's what his doctorate was in. That's what he was professor of hormones specifically. And so if we're kind of summing up here, I would say that although I like some of his dietary advice, and I teased at the beginning what part of his like diet I do, so I could say that, reveal that before we finish. But I think people who are a fan of his often look at the recommendations, and then, he was taking thyroid, he was taking DHEA at least a lot of the time, he was taking pregnenolone at least a lot of the time, he was taking progesterone at least some of the time, and certainly recommending it for most women. And yet, his fans are often really reluctant to do those things, and they just want to do the diet. And my opinion is, yes, if someone's metabolically flexible, and I see often his young followers do this, and with some success, at least temporarily, just going onto a really high carb, often, fruit, sucrose, fructose, moderately low protein diet, moderately low fat diet, and getting, supercharging the metabolism. It will work as long as you're metabolically flexible. But I see a lot of other people doing it, and often older or more sickly, and really suffering. And that's because they don't have that metabolic flexibility. And often, honestly, just becoming overweight. The stories of people, becoming diabetic, becoming insulin resistant, certainly a lot of people gaining weight by their own admission. And you could say, well, that Peat's diet doesn't work. But if you're going to defend his approach, you've got to remember it wasn't only food. Like he was saying, not everyone, but in a lot of cases, it's appropriate to add a certain amount of thyroid to boost the metabolism, not just a dietary intervention. I don't know. I think out of the people who've tried the so-called, I know some people say it doesn't exist, Ray Peat diet, who have found it didn't work, I wonder what percentage were also following all of the hormonal supplement recommendations. And I bet it's, the majority of people who it didn't work for, that was a reason why. Now, there's other reasons. He didn't really acknowledge the even existence or certainly importance of candida infections, for instance, fungal infections. He felt it was no big deal and easily treated and all the rest of it. I think that's definitely a reason why if you start eating a ton of fruit or a ton of sugar, and you have a candidal overgrowth already, or some other kind of fungal overgrowth, it's going to make it worse. If you're already insulin resistant and you're not careful, you could make it worse. If you're already overweight, you can make it worse. And if your genetics just mean that you're not very good at processing carbohydrates, you can make it worse. That's just off the top of my head. Like there's probably a bunch of reasons why it doesn't work, but I'd still argue that it's fair to say that one of the main reasons it doesn't work for people is because they don't follow all the advice. They only do the diet, and sometimes the supplements as well, but they're not doing the actual hormones because, certainly in the case of thyroid, it's classed as a medication. It's, it's only available via prescription, which, I'm not against that per se. Although I think, as I said, they go a bit far by banning, any natural hormones, even in animal glandulars. But, so you could say that you're not really giving it a fair shot if you're not also including some of the other things with it, like the pregnenolone or like the T3 or natural desiccated thyroid.
That's a really, really important point, is that sometimes people will pick and choose and not follow everything as it is laid out. They'll just be like, well, I'll just do A and B, but I just really don't need to do C and D. And then it doesn't work. And then they're like, yeah, it didn't work.
Yeah. And just to clarify, he's not, he didn't say that everyone should take any of those hormones, but, from what I see, like a lot of people are candidates for it because their temperature is low. They have a lot of symptoms of hypothyroidism. They do the diet. It isn't enough. Their temperature's still low. They still have a lot of symptoms of hypothyroid. And then they just persist with the diet rather than realizing, well, if I were P, I would be adding the hormonal support. It's just not doing it the way that he taught, from my understanding. One of the corrections in the comment section, which I think I have to 100% hold my hands up and say it's true, is a lot of Ray Peat followers say that he was against starch as a source of fuel. That even though he was pro-carbs, he preferred fructose and sucrose. And sucrose is just fructose and glucose bonded together. Starch is very long chains of glucose. And the argument is that long chains of glucose starch are like it takes a while to digest them and break them down, and they are then food for bad bacteria. And a lot of Peat's approach we didn't talk about today was like minimizing the level of those bacteria to be any bacteria in places like the small intestine. And so eating starch kind of increases that proliferation of bacteria. And so because of that, which I think are all fair to say that's all stuff that Peat says, they like starch are bad. But there is one exception. There is one food that Peat was a big fan of and in fact tried to live off at one time, and it's potatoes. And, he had, this theory. I haven't looked into it enough to know if it's true, but that even though the level of protein in potatoes is very low, compared to something like, I don't know, other starch forms like, I don't know, wheat or beans or something, that they were a type of amino acids that are very easily utilized by the body. And so they were still an excellent source of protein, potatoes, from his perspective. And so, he was a big fan of potato, I guess that's the point. He was also a big fan of nixtamalized corn, which is where it's kind of broken down and made more easy to digest. So there were some starches that he was actually a fan of in reality. As I say, especially potato. I'm pretty sure he tried to do a all potato diet for a while. So you could hardly say he's against starch. So that's probably, of all the criticisms of my previous episode on Peat, I think that one's the fairest, the most accurate. So I'll just set the record straight. And I have to say, even though I don't eat fruit and sugar, my primary carbohydrate source is potato. And so I have a lot of potato and I have a lot of dairy. And he was a big fan of both of those. And even though I think his like most recommended diet that I saw the most often would be like skim milk and orange juice as like a basis of the calorie source. So we're talking about, the carbs coming from lactose and fructose, I guess, rather than starch, long chain glucose like I use. He was a fan of the increasing the calcium to phosphate ratio, which basically in practice means getting more protein, especially from dairy, and less from pretty much everywhere else. Nuts, seeds, meat, fish, they're all quite high in phosphate compared to calcium. So dairy is a bit of an exception that it's high calcium to phosphate. I'm specifically doing it because of my history of lead toxicity and chronic calcium deficiency for a long time, which I think contributed to that lead toxicity a lot. So I'm doing this low calcium diet at least until I'm doing this high calcium diet at least until my lead is very low. Right now it's 10 times lower than it was when I discovered it a few years ago, but I'd like to get it, 10 times lower again, then I'll be truly satisfied. But maybe I'll stop having the high calcium diet before that. Anyway, I'm doing it for now. So as I said, yeah, like a dairy and fruit diet is maybe an ultimate simple Peat diet from my point of view. I'm having, it's not only that, but a lot of dairy and potatoes, which I think would also be a Peat approved diet. So that's not why I'm doing it, but I am still doing a version of a kind of Ray Peat diet in the end. So I tried to do the maths recently. Between 2008 and 2022, I easily spent over $100,000 on supplements that ultimately did nothing for me because nobody told me my genetics made me desperately need some nutrients like tyrosine, lysine, and vitamin K2, while making me also really struggle to break down some chemicals like histamine and aldehydes. I was just throwing money at balls while staying chronically unhealthy. Advanced Health Genetics All Access would have saved me literally decades of trial and error and well over $100,000. Here's how it works. If you have one, you upload your existing raw DNA file from companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, if you've ever done any of those. And within hours, you get over 500 reports that spell out exactly which vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and essential fats you're genetically wired to run out of first. Things like vitamin B12, zinc, magnesium, EPA, DHA, folate, iron, basically all of them. You'll find out which foods secretly wreck you. Maybe saturated fats, maybe it's carbs, maybe it's oxalates or salicylates, maybe salt. You'll get your personal inflammation score, insulin resistance score, visceral fat tendency, artery hardening risk. You'll get hormone and neurotransmitter weak spots. It's testosterone conversion, cortisol clearance, dopamine synthesis, estrogen issues, and you'll get fitness DNA reports. Like, are you built for marathons or sprints? Do your tendons tear easily? Do you have a tendency to quick or slow recovery? And every recommendation in all those reports is scored from 1 to 5 for impact and evidence. So it's really clear to you the 5 things that you can do to fix this month instead of like 100 things to overwhelm you, which may be a tendency if you listen to a lot of different podcasts with a lot of different conflicting advice. Plus, you get every new report we add for life for free. And yes, we're fully GDPR compliant. We anonymize your data. We store it separately from your name and let you delete everything in one click if you want to. Don't make the same $100,000 mistake I did. How do you get started? Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com, and if you have an old DNA file, upload it and you'll have your first reports in hours. If you don't, select the DNA kit option and we'll send you a DNA kit where you just do a really simple saliva collection and send it back. Advanced Health Genetics is already by far the most affordable DNA reporting company of its kind. But if you use the code Rejuvenate at checkout, you get an additional 20% off your order. Click the link in the description or pinned comment right now. Your DNA is waiting to tell you exactly what it needs. Let's listen.
So for our last theory of the episode, here we go. Undereating makes you fat.
Yeah, well, this is one that really upsets. Like, this is one I've kind of taken on. I mean, Ray Peat didn't say it's as simple as this. I'm not saying it's as simple as this. But I do think there's an element of truth to this, and it like really upset people. So let me explain why I think there's an element of truth to this. Because when you undereat, you slow your metabolism, right? I think everyone agrees on that. Even the people who are pro-fasting, they agree with that. Their thing is that it's temporary. Okay. The thing is, it isn't always temporary. It goes back to that thing of metabolic flexibility. The younger you are, the healthier you are, the more you can, not eat. Your body adapts, slows down your metabolism, conserves energy. Start eating again. Your body's like, great, we have loads of calories again. Speeds up your metabolism, adapts, stops conserving energy. That's the ideal scenario. That's the scenario that people who recommend fasting or restricting calories, whether it's for health or weight loss, are basing their recommendations on. The thing is, it's not as simple as that in many cases. You could say, well, as long as you're healthy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but most of the people who are doing this stuff aren't healthy. That's why they're doing it. There's that minority of people who are just trying to optimize only. And, I meet them occasionally in events. I meet them occasionally as clients. But most people, even if they're generally healthy, they got some significant thing going on that's enough to get them into all this stuff in the first place. And again, especially as you get older and all the rest of it, if you're not really optimal, and both in terms of your lifestyle, but even your genetics, some people have just been dealt a bad hand, even if they've had a very healthy lifestyle their whole life. And by the time you get older, especially, or just less healthy in general, your body doesn't just bounce back. And so when you're undereating, here's the thing. Undereating or not eating, it's not sustainable unless you're forcing it to be sustainable with powerful drugs. I always joke, that amphetamine is also a very good way of losing weight because it reduces your appetite so much. And I was just watching something the other day, and there's some influencer now who is saying that's exactly what he does, like genuinely as part of his list of recommendations. He's all about how to be as good looking as possible, which is funny. I guess not often that guys, that's their primary positioning in the marketplace, I guess. So I guess that's original. But yeah, in his list is, be thin. I guess that's pretty typical with people talking about how to be good looking. But tall in the arsenal. Amphetamine, okay, that's interesting. These days, usually it's GLP-1s or whatever, but it's the same principle. What do they have in common? It's forcing yourself not to want to eat with a powerful drug, right? rather than actually fixing the satiety hormone signal in your body, which is leptin, which we've talked about in other episodes, it's forcing yourself not to be hungry. And really, it's excessive. And so you can force yourself to not eat much, not eat enough, and then you will lose weight. It's absolutely true. But the question is, how long can you do it for? And how long should you do it for? So how long can you do it for? If you're not using some powerful drug, then the answer is usually not very long. If you are using some powerful drug, then it can be a long time, as long as you can survive using the drug. Because a lot of the time the side effects just of the drug. But then you can get all kinds of other problems, which we're seeing now with GLP-1s, the class action lawsuits and all the rest of it. If you carry on not consuming enough calories for a long time, you're also going to not consume enough nutrients for a long time. You're not going to have enough amino acids. You're not going to have enough minerals. You're not going to have enough vitamins. You're not going to have enough essential fats. And then that can cause all kinds of other severe problems. But let's just go back to the more common thing, like how would not eating or not eating enough make you fat? Well, if you don't eat enough, you slow down your metabolism. If you slow down your metabolism, unless you're cheating with powerful drugs, which then lead to even worse problems, medium to long term, you're going to start eating again. And when you start, you're going to start eating a lot again. Sorry to clarify. And when you start eating a lot again, it's probably not going to be whatever you think is optimally. You're probably going to be binging on high energy foods. It's going to be carbohydrates and it's going to be fats. And it's probably going to be an unhealthy combination with not enough protein and not enough nutrients with it, because they're usually the most palatable and the most convenient and cheapest and easily available. So you're going to start binging on high energy, so usually high carbs and fat, low nutrient foods. And when you do that, you're going to be starting to make up for your lack of energy that you've had for all the time you've been not eating enough, but you're going to be not making up for the lack of nutrients for all that time you haven't been eating enough. So you're going to want to eat more and more and more because your body's trying to make up for the nutritional deficit. And so people have this and they go through this phase of binge and purge, binge and purge. This is the absolute classic dieting thing that well over 90% of people who are overweight are on, or at least have been on for a significant period of time before they eventually give up. This is why I've made Hormetic's weight optimization system one of my missions, because, my ultimate goal is to resolve chronic illness. And this is just the most high leverage, most important element of it is just the amount of people who are suffering with this, who are actually trying to follow the advice, applying willpower, applying self-discipline, all the rest of it, but the advice is bad. And so they're yo-yoing between following the advice, not being able to follow the advice anymore, doing things with, outside their own control. I've had people tell me, literally, it feels like I've been possessed, and I walk into the restaurant or I walk into the shop and I'm eating this thing. And then next thing I know, I wake up and oh my God, what did I do? What happened? And I believe them. I don't think they're lying. I think, as I said, unless you're taking very powerful drugs, your body eventually takes over and goes, I need some energy. And it forces it into you, when you're not present. And so, yeah, when you don't eat enough, you get fat. Not like literally in most cases. It does happen, and Dr. Miriam and I have talked about it in one of the episodes on hormetics and weight loss, about there's some people who just slow down the metabolism and then they're barely eating and they still can't lose weight, and sometimes they're even gaining weight. So that's sometimes how it happens, but that's not everyone. But the more common thing is it's just not sustainable. And eventually you do eat, and then you eat too much and you eat the wrong thing, and then you become overweight, and then you try and fast again, or, calorie control again and all the rest of it. And you just go back and forth and back and forth. And yeah, there's a reason 97% of diets fail. And it's not lack of willpower. It's not lack of self-discipline. It's not lack of organization and thinking ahead even, although those are all helpful qualities. It's bad strategy. What you've been told to do doesn't work. There's no reason it would work. It actually makes things worse. And, if you get conspiratorial, you can go into, I guess it's more profitable to treat a customer for life than to cure them, than to actually solve their issue. But I honestly don't think that's what most people I've met in the weight loss space, that's not it. Like, they really believe it, and they're often doing it themselves, and they're being really hard on themselves, and they're really struggling as well to stick to these diets, and they're often cheating. They are doing hormonal interventions, and maybe they're on growth hormone if they're a male, maybe they're on testosterone, maybe they're doing plastic surgery, maybe they're doing maybe they're on amphetamines. These days they're all on GLP-1s. They're doing every cheat they can but people kind of compartmentalize, and they justify to themselves that they're only teaching the diet and or exercise despite doing all that other stuff. Somehow, I guess it's case by case. And some of them teach that other stuff too, to be fair, especially, GLP-1s these days. But it's all not sustainable. And as I said, my experience in the industry is it's not actually cynical and conspiratorial. It's delusional people who really believe it. Maybe they're lucky and it works for them because, as I said, they're strong and metabolically flexible and have good self-discipline. But often it isn't sustainable then as they get older and their hormones start to suffer. Then it's not sustainable for them anymore, and then they start looking for more and more cheats, which they may or may not tell their audience about. And it's all just because it's the wrong strategy. This is the thing, like, motivation is great. I was a big fan of Tony Robbins and all those kind of people. And to be fair to Tony Robbins, he always said, I'm a strategist, not a motivational speaker. And, that's fair. But working harder, setting bigger goals, pushing further, all that kind of stuff can be good. But it's like if you run twice as fast towards a destination, you are likely to reach there twice as quickly. It's true. But if you run twice as fast in the opposite direction, not only are you not getting to your goal faster, but you're actually getting further away faster than if you just... So I say that as an analogy to say, the people who actually the most obedient, they stick to the diet the best, they're the most compliant, they're the most disciplined, all the rest of it, like, they're actually in a worse position often. They're going to wreck their metabolism more. They're going to wreck their hormones more. They're going to make it even more difficult to actually lose weight because they're sticking to it. So again, if you failed at diets, to me, I don't see someone who's weak and lacking willpower or whatever. I see someone, maybe who's actually like stronger willed than the average person, which is why they've got themselves into such a mess in the first place, because if they were using the wrong strategy. And unfortunately, the wrong strategy, again, running in the wrong direction faster will get you further away faster, not closer faster.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many good points there. But the biggest thing, and I was having a chat with my husband today as well. It's like, I'm just trying to make sure he's going on. He's got lots of work coming up and everything else, and I just said, you've got to have enough fuel in your body. And so I started tracking. He started doing that, which is really great. And I'm just looking. I'm like, you're not eating enough. You're just not. Like, there's not enough fuel going in. And so, that's one other aspect of it. But yeah, like you just said, being so compliant on something that is moving the needle in the opposite direction, it's just going to have a worse impact for you.
Yeah, and this is like, this is a, I don't know, matriarchal or feminine kind of quality that I think has been lost recently. But, it's the old... you're not eating enough. Like, let me, like the old Italian mother kind of, or grandmother kind of archetype, right? You look like you're not eating enough. Like, that's something that's not really talked about these days. But if we think about when that was a common archetype, when that was a typical experience that you wouldn't just see in movies, but you'd actually be, on the other end of from someone, like, the obesity rate was less than 1%. and now it's over 40%. So now, am I saying, it's not quite as simple as that opening statement, right? Like not eating enough makes you fat, but there is an element to it where it is 100% true, which I've just explained, right? And if you're eating enough of the right things, you're never going to get into that mess in the first place, hopefully. And some people just have a genetic tendency to it, and some people were obese even 100 years ago, of course, like it does happen, and especially as you get older and your hormones become generally less optimized as you get older. It's a lot more common as a 60-year-old 100 years ago than it was as a 20-year-old. But so that instinct that you have, especially with someone like your husband, who's certainly not overweight, right? Like to make sure they're eating enough, because in that case, they're not eating enough. And again, it affects everyone differently. It's going to result in stress. That's the problem. And that was the big thing that Ray Peat was focused on, just to bring it all the way full circle. He certainly wasn't a weight loss guru, right? Like his goal with people was to help them to have enough energy so that they can not be in a state of stress. That was like the number one, what I took from it anyway, the number one goal of the whole system.
Yeah, and I think that is the biggest part about it is, being in that optimal state so that everything's working well. And there's a few factors that it takes to get you there.
It's funny, I saw a YouTube comment just yesterday, and it was like, you mentioned, you were adrenally burned out. What did you do to get out of it? And I was thinking about it. I was like, can I direct them to an episode that already exists? And I was like, God, the episode I'd probably direct them to is like the one on hypoglycemia or something, because it's really like blood sugar balance is like really the starting place. It's not meditation, it's not breath work, it's not going to therapy stuff and all the rest of it. It is just blood sugar. And I have to say, give credit where credit's due. I think that is yet another insight that I have to give Pete credit for. He's the one, not the only one, but probably the originator of that realization in me. And it's such a key realization.
Yeah, you've definitely passed that on to me from that thing of, and I've mentioned it before, of keeping your blood sugar in that good state so that you're fueled. Because yesterday is typical. Running around, I had to go drop something off over here, then traffic hit and I was over there and just coming back, and then it got to the point. And I had to go to the grocery store and I was like, oh, I'm so hungry. I should be eating my dinner right now. And I could really feel my body, just my mood, my body, my energy, just everything just. And then when I came home, it was one of those things where I had the option of really being very typical, come in, why isn't this done to absolutely everybody? And I'm like, no, hold off. I know exactly why I'm feeling this way. I'm underfueled. And so then I was like, oh, let me just unpack the groceries. Let me make my food. Let me refuel. Let me settle. And I'm going to go to bed. It was just one of those fits like, I'm just going to go to bed. But prior to this work that we've been doing here on this podcast and the education that you've helped me with, and I'm sure you've helped, a lot of our listeners with, I would have, that evening would have gone so much differently.
Yeah. Well, awareness is a huge part of it. So that's awesome. And then things like planning ahead and, all the rest of it, like they do become more important, but the awareness is far more important. Like you just said, like that's the bigger battle. So that's awesome.
Yeah, no, it was good. Well, this has been great. I do love, Dr. Ray Peat, his insights, his things, and also too, just being able to have conversations about it because, it helps you figure out, okay, what's not real, but where to invest in and where to maybe investigate further in. So no, these are really, really good. Do you want to add anything before we finish?
Yeah, again, I'm not claiming to be a Ray Peat expert. I'm not claiming to be a Ray Peat influencer or whatever it might be, or student. All I'm doing is giving credit where credit is due to a bunch of his ideas that I now also share because I think they're true and true is truth. And giving my, takes on all of them as a person who is unbiased, who doesn't have to agree with everything he says because I'm a Ray Peat influencer, because I'm in the Ray Peat sphere. So I hope that, you take it that way. I don't claim to be an authority. I am simply someone who is, I'd say unbiased, simply looking for the truth, doesn't have to conform, doesn't have to, worry about what all my other influencer friends are going to say if I deviate from the narrative. and just give credit where credit is due, that, and help to spread awareness, I hope.
So listeners, thanks again. As always, it's your time. We know it's very, very valuable, very, very precious, and we are so grateful that you choose to spend it with us. Please remember to help support our sponsors, because it helps support this podcast so we can keep bringing you more episodes like this. Please remember to hit that like and subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss an episode, and we'll see you next time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode. And one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there. Or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.